So lipids, lipids. We as animals have evolved to really like lipids. The reason is because lipids are the most efficient way to carry energy around. We have more energy in lipids than we do in pretty much any other source of fuel in our body, unless you happen to have a very low body fat, in which you probably have more energy in your muscle than you do in lipids. But in general, most people store the bulk of their energy in the form of lipids. In fact, the amount of energy we can store in lipids, we generally measure that, or at least the ability of our body to simply survive off of lipids is measured in weeks, whereas what we can store in the form of carbohydrates is basically about a day. So that kind of gives you an idea of how important lipids are for long-term energy storage. So anyways, so as we can see here, things like cheesecake and carrot cake, the reason they taste good is not because they're sweet, it's because they have such a high lipid content. And that is what truly satisfies us as animals, is that lipid intake. So we will look at several classes of lipids. We're going to start off with fatty acids, which are the building block of all lipids, with the exception of the steroids. All the other classes of lipids use fatty acids in some form or another as a building block. The simplest of the lipids are triacylglycerols, and these are simply a storage lipid. We basically stick 3 fatty acids onto a molecule of glycerol, and we pack it into a fat cell, and we're done with it until we need the energy for fuel. Waxes are used as protection, so we find them on the surfaces of a lot of living organisms. Great place to find waxes would be on plants. Their leaves are often coated with wax. Fruit often gets coated with wax. Additionally, a lot of animals use wax secreted in certain areas that will be in contact with water or the atmosphere. So generally, any sort of protection, attempt to prevent water loss, a lot of that is achieved by the use of waxes. Phospholipids and sphingolipids are both used in our membranes, and they basically separate one aqueous environment from another. We'll look at them in a little bit of detail. And then finally, steroids. These give rise to, they're important for membranes, but also what we often think of steroids as being used for is a variety of hormones that are used to signal things within our body. So steroid hormones, we'll look at them briefly several chapters from now, but in general, the steroids such as cholesterol are largely membrane proteins, which we'll look at a little bit in more detail the next chapter. So fatty acids are comprised of a relatively long hydrocarbon chain with a single fatty acid at one end of it. So the example that we have here, linolenic acid, basically there are 18 carbons. There are 3 carbon-carbon double bonds that we see here. And there is 1 carboxylic acid. The carboxylic acid is always found at carbon number 1. So if we want to go through and classify this, first of all, this is an unsaturated fatty acid that contains 18 carbon. As most fatty acids do, most fatty acids contain an even number of carbons. So in general, the smallest fatty acids we usually find are about 12 carbons, and they go all the way up to 22 is still fairly common. Once we get beyond 22, 24 and 26 carbon fatty acids are somewhat rare in nature. So generally the most common are probably 14, 16, 18. Those are really the most common. 20 is seen as well, though we not nearly as often as the 14, 16, and 18 carbon fatty acids. Our example here, linolenic acid, represents an unsaturated fatty acid, specifically a polyunsaturated fatty acid. Basically, a saturated fatty acid would have nothing but carbon-carbon single bonds. An unsaturated fatty acid has at least 1 carbon-carbon double bond. So monounsaturated fatty acid would have a single carbon-carbon double bond. Polyunsaturated fatty acid would have multiple carbon-carbon double bonds. So the example here, linolenic acid, is a polyunsaturated fatty acid. One thing to note, all the bonds here are in the cis conformation. It's relatively rare in naturally occurring fatty acids to find trans double bonds. So this is actually kind of an important thing, because the double bonds, when they're incorporated into a fatty acid, particularly if they are a membrane lipid, basically they help to kind of make the membrane a little bit more fluid-like, because the unsaturated fatty acids tend to be basically, they are more oil-like, whereas saturated are much more fat-like. Basically think of butter versus vegetable oil. Vegetable oil, liquid at room temperature. Butter is a solid at room temperature. Butter has much greater saturated fatty acid content, whereas your vegetable oil has much more unsaturated fatty acid. Now, if we look at the nomenclature that I have down here for linolenic acid, basically the 18 colon 3 delta 9 12 15. What this tells us is the 18 tells us the number of carbons, the 3 tells us the number of double bonds, and the delta followed by the various numbers here tells us the position, the carbon number of those double bonds. So for example, the first carbon-carbon double bond is found, this is carbon 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So our first double bond is found at carbon 9. The next one should be at carbon 12. So here's 10, 11, 12, and then 13, 14. Our last one is found at carbon 15. So that's how we usually notate the fatty acids, kind of a shorthand way instead of drawing it out. We'll very often use this numbering system to basically give essentially the specs on the different fatty acids that we're talking about. So if we look at saturated versus unsaturated fatty acids, up here at the top, we've got two saturated fatty acids, and notice they pack together very nicely. They would make a very nice crystalline compound. Essentially, organic molecules that can pack together very nicely generally tend to be a solid at room temperature. And that is the case with saturated fatty acids. They pack together very nicely, they form a solid, and as a result, they are not going to be they tend to, if they're found in a membrane, for example, they're going to make that membrane much more crystalline in nature rather than fluid. So, and we'll talk a lot more about fluid versus crystalline when we look a little bit more in depth at membranes in the next chapter. Unsaturated fatty acids tend to disrupt the nice packing. So you see how, all of a sudden we've got this big kink in our molecule, and the rest of the molecule is going off in this direction here. As a result, it's not going to pack very nicely. If we try to put another fatty acid here, basically what it's going to do is it's going to encounter this, and it's going to kind of have to wrap around it in some fashion. Generally, what that's going to do is it's going to lead to a lowering of the melting point of this conglomeration of fatty acids. So if we have nothing but saturated fatty acids, we expect a relatively high melting point. Once we start throwing in unsaturated fatty acids, we're going to lower the melting point of that assembly of fatty acids. Ultimately, what that's going to do, more motion, and as a result, more fluid-like properties to whatever the fat, whether it be a membrane or a cooking oil or something like that. We're going to see much more fluid-like movement as a result of that. So if we look at fatty acids in foods, keeping in mind that most of the fatty acids we find in food occur in the triacylglycerols that are present in our food. So basically what we can say is that in general, animals are going to have a relatively high saturated fatty acid content, whereas plants will generally have a relatively high unsaturated fatty acid content. So looking at some examples, for example, beef, obviously an animal, it contains fairly large amounts of palmitic and stearic. Palmitic is a 16-carbon fatty acid. Stearic is an 18-carbon fatty acid. Both of these are saturated, so pretty much over 50% of the fat that we find in beef is going to be in the form of saturated fatty acids. It does have a relatively high content of oleic acid. Oleic acid is an 18-carbon monounsaturated fatty acid. Milk, this would be cow's milk, actually has a somewhat similar makeup than in relation to cows, because that's the source of the milk. So, relatively, 25% palmitic acid, 12% stearic acid. It does have a relatively high oleic acid that corresponds pretty nicely with what we see in beef, and the linoleic acid corresponds pretty nicely with what we see in beef. So again, relatively high saturated fatty acid content, but it does contain a fair amount of unsaturated fats as well. Coconut oil is a rather interesting oil. It's made largely of lauric and myristic fatty acids. These are 12 and 14 carbon saturated fatty acids. Relatively little of the rest of the saturated fatty acids, and fairly high content of the monounsaturated fatty acid oleic acid. Basically, coconut oil is one of those oils that is starting to help us realize that our view on saturated fatty acids has actually been somewhat wrong. We are starting to realize that there are a lot of cultures that are very dependent on coconut oil for a lot of their cooking, and we are finding that a lot of individuals in these cultures are not displaying the high problem levels of potential heart disease and things like that we've normally associated for this long time with saturated fatty acids. And this is actually leading us to reconsider our notion that saturated fatty acids are bad for the heart. In fact, there's a lot of evidence showing that it's not necessarily the fatty acids we're eating, but the levels of carbohydrate that we're eating. Additionally, we are starting to find that once we thought that all unsaturated fatty acids were good for us, but we're finding that some of the polyunsaturated fatty acids are not good for us. In fact, we're also finding that some of the polyunsaturated fatty acids that we find specifically in things like corn tend to be fairly bad for us. And if we look at corn, what we see is that there's a relatively high content of linoleic acid. The linoleic acid content being upwards of 50% in corn is actually not the best for us. Linoleic acid is a polyunsaturated fatty acid. It's prone to oxidation. The oxidized byproducts of some of these molecules can be potentially damaging for us. We compare that, for example, with olive oil. Olive oil's predominant fat is a monounsaturated fat, oleic acid. Monounsaturated fats do not undergo the same oxidation that the polyunsaturated fats can go. So therefore, it's highly probable that olive oil is much better for us than corn oil, particularly if we are cooking with it. Well, one other thing to note is palm oil, which has gained a fairly large following lately. Notice it has a fairly high content of monounsaturated fat, and it also has a fairly high content of the saturated fatty acid palmitic acid. And in general, there are a lot of people that are looking at palm oil as essentially an alternative to corn oil. Of course, one problem with palm oil is that it tends to be grown on plantations that have basically ripped out the jungle to make these plantations, which one would say generally is not the best of ideas. So anyways, last one here, safflower oil. Safflower oil is one of those that we very frequently see listed on ingredients. Safflower oil, unfortunately, is a polyunsaturated fatty acid and is therefore prone to possible oxidation. So in general, my feeling on safflower oil is to try to avoid it at all costs. Instead, going for something more like olive oil or palm or coconut oil are generally preferable to the high linoleic acid that we see in safflower oil.